So a while back I did a video where I basically me and a couple of friends tried on a bunch of different watches, and each of my friends had a different sized wrist, and so we tried on different watches to kind of see which watches looked best given our different wrist sizes. And that's turned out to be one of the more popular videos that I've done. I get a ton of questions on that one. A lot of people are curious about if a certain watch will look good on their wrist. And so I kind of want to do a follow-up video to that and talk just a little bit more about this kind of wrist size versus watch size, and yeah, see if we can help clear that up a little bit. All right, so before we get started, I want to dedicate this episode to a couple of my subscribers, Keith Textor, Mr. Disco 99, Jason L, and Jarrell Ivy. Thank you guys for watching all the way to the end of the videos. Really appreciate it. All right, let's go ahead and talk today about today's topic. We're going to be looking at how you can kind of tell if a watch is going to look good on your wrist or not as far as the size goes. So the way this often plays up is you see a watch online and you're wondering, is this watch going to look good on my wrist? So I want to talk about 5 things you can look at as you're evaluating a watch to try and get a better sense of whether or not the watch is going to fit well on your wrist. Obviously, the best thing to do is to try it on if you get the opportunity. But even when you try it on, maybe you don't know what to exactly to look for and how to really judge if it looks like it's fitting well. So hopefully these 5 things will help you sort of evaluate whether or not a watch is going to fit well on your wrist. I will say to a large degree, it does come down to what your personal preference is. I think that's the biggest factor is if you're comfortable with the way a watch looks on your wrist, then I don't see a problem with it. Now there's kind of 2 things. I think you have to kind of keep 2 situations in mind, and are we talking about more formal situation, business situation, and versus a casual one? The rules with casual watches I think are much looser, and you know what? People are less likely to judge you based on your appearance in a casual situation, and their opinions of you are going to mean less than in a formal or business setting. So like if you're going in for a job interview or something like that, I think that's when you especially want to be careful about the kind of watch you want to wear and how you want to present yourself. I think it's possible to pull off a large watch. I think when I see someone wearing a larger watch, I tend to think, oh, so they must be a pretty confident person. They must have, really want some attention. They want to kind of show off this sort of large blingy piece on their wrist. And if that's your personality and you can get away with it, I think it works. The other thing that might come to mind if I see someone wearing a large watch is just that watch just looks too big on them. It looks like they're wearing, it makes them look smaller, like they're wearing like their dad's watch or something like that. And that's kind of, I think, what you definitely want to avoid. And that's, it's maybe a little bit unfortunate, but it seems to be larger guys have it easier, whereas if you're a smaller guy and you wear a watch that's too big, you might run the risk of sort of accentuating your physical size and making yourself appear smaller than you are if the watch, looks like it's too big on your wrist. So, so if you have a larger wrist size, it's maybe a little bit easier to get away with that kind of stuff, and you have a little bit easier. For people with smaller wrists, it's a little bit harder to find something that's going to look good on them. So with that said, let's kind of talk a little bit about some of the ways that you can tell if a watch is going to look too big for you or if it's going to look too small. All right, number one thing you need to keep in mind is that the watch size is going to look different on different people's wrists. It's a very simple thing. So if you have small wrists, smaller watches are going to look good. But if you have large wrists, then you can get away with a larger wrist size. So that's where I think that previous video really comes in handy, and encourage you guys to go back and watch that if you're curious, because then you can just kind of see what different size watches are going to look like on different wrists. So don't write off a watch as being too small or too big just purely based on the specs. You also need to keep in mind what your wrist size is. So it's helpful to take a piece of string out, wrap it around your wrist, measure it, see what your wrist size is, and then you can kind of get an idea for how a different watch is going to look on your wrist. I have a 7.5-inch wrist, so if you look at my videos and see me trying on watches, that'll give you some idea of how it would look on a 7.5-inch wrist. But again, if you go back and watch that previous video, you can see how different watches look on smaller wrists as well. Obviously, the most important measurement to keep in mind is the diameter of the watch, but this is very misleading, and I think this is the one that everyone tends to focus on because it's the easiest one, and again, it is the most important one, but the diameter doesn't tell the whole story. So let's talk about some of the other measurements that also are important, and we'll kind of go through. So second thing to keep in mind when you're shopping around for a watch is to keep in mind to pay attention to what the lug to lug is on the watch. So that's the distance from the lug tip to lug tip. So it's how long the watch is. And really what you want to watch out for here is you do not want a watch where the lugs are basically hanging over the edge of your wrist. So sometimes a watch will have longer lugs, and then when you put it on, if you have a smaller wrist, if your wrist is smaller than the lugs and they don't fit well, there's going to be some it's going to look like it hangs past your wrist. And that, I think, is a bad look. That tends to mean that the watch is too large for you. And so you want to kind of keep in mind with that. So with that, you want to try on some different watches and get a feel for what lug to lug is, because that's really, it has a lot to do with the shape of your wrist. If you have a flatter wrist on top, maybe you can get away with longer lugs. But if your whole wrist is kind of round, even if it's two people can both have 7-inch wrists, but if one wrist is rounder and one wrist is flatter, the watch is going to wear differently. So you kind of got to try that one on and get a feel for what lug size works with you, and that's something that you're just going to hit by trial and error. But keep an eye for that overhang. Another thing to keep in mind here with this lug to lug distance, if you're looking at a watch that has a fitted bracelet, sometimes the first link on that bracelet is actually going to extend past the lugs, effectively lengthening the lug to lug. So a watch might wear differently depending on whether it's on a fitted bracelet or if it's on a leather strap or some other kind of strap. NATO straps also tend to kind of lengthen the watch a little bit on top. So you got to kind of be careful of the strap as well. And then another thing when you're talking about lugs, it's also important to pay attention to the case shape, because some cases are more curved where the lugs kind of curve down and they hug the wrist better, and that'll give you a better fit as well. So if it has more of a kind of a curved case shape, then it will also tend to fit your wrist better, even if the lug to lug is a little bit larger. Third thing to keep in mind when you're looking at a watch trying to see if it's going to look like if it's going to wear large or small is actually the crystal size, I think. And that's something that's harder to measure because you don't often see the measurement of the crystal. But it tends to be, I think, the larger the crystal is, the larger the watch looks. So mostly this is going to affect watches that have bezels. So if you have a watch, like dive watches, actually they tend to be larger watches, but they don't always look as large as they are because the bezel will kind of optically draw the eye in a little bit, and it'll give this illusion of the watch being smaller than it actually is. Also, you can have watches that the case will be, maybe like a cushion shape or something like that, which will increase the diameter of the watch, but the dial and the crystal of the watch will actually be a little bit smaller. And so, that will often make the watch look a little bit smaller. So if you're looking for a watch, and you look and you see it, it's got a really big diameter that typically you wouldn't wear. But if you notice that the crystal is smaller compared to the rest of the watch, it might not look as big on your wrist as you would think it is. All right, now the number 4 thing you want to keep in mind is the height of the watch. Now this is mostly going to come into play when you're talking about dress watches and watches that you want to kind of slip under the cuff. If the watch is too thick, it's going to pop out of your sleeve and your cuff is not going to go over it, and that's going to be kind of an odd look. Maybe a little bit distracting if you're trying to wear a suit or a dress shirt. So generally for dress watches, thinner is better. You want to keep it around 10 millimeters or less. Other than that, so the height of the watch kind of has an interesting effect. So you can have a smaller watch, but if it has a tall height on it, it's going to give it more wrist presence and make it a little bit more noticeable. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. Again, I tend to prefer watches to be thinner the better. But if you want, if you have like a smaller wrist and you want sort of a watch that has larger wrist presence, that's going to be more noticeable, but is not going to look too big for you, that's where, finding a watch that's maybe a little bit taller can actually help in that. So if you want to kind of have a more substantial look to a watch on your wrist without it, kind of dominating it, if you can find a watch that has a good lug to lug, nice small diameter, but then a little bit taller, I think that's a good way to go and a good way to kind of get that look for guys with smaller wrists. All right, so number 5 thing to keep in mind when you're looking around for a watch is the kind of watch it is and the situation that you're going to wear it. Again, we sort of touched on this before, I think, but if you're talking about a formal watch, a dress watch, it should be smaller than a casual watch. So if you're looking at dress watches, smaller tends to be better. A small dress watch is going to look more sophisticated. It's going to look more stylish. It's going to be less likely to sort of turn people off. It's going to be, maybe probably less noticeable, which in formal situations is what you want. You don't want something huge and attention-getting, usually, unless that's your personality and that's what the situation calls for. But typically, you want something a little bit more understated when you're looking at a dress watch. So in that case, dress your style watches. If you're intending to wear it in a dress situation, you want to go smaller is better. Now, it's fine to wear a dress watch in a more casual situation. Then the rules kind of shift again, and it's okay, I think, to wear a larger one. But typically, if you're buying a dress watch, you want it to probably fill both of those roles. You want to be able to wear it more casually and actually wear it as a dress watch. So that's why I think it's important when you're shopping for a dress watch to think of it as if you're going to wear it in a dress situation and to try and size it accordingly. But when it comes to more casual watches, I think the rules are, again, a lot looser. And again, it sort of depends on the type of watch. Again, divers, a lot of times with those bezels, will wear smaller than the diameter would suggest. Fliegers or aviation style watches, historically, they were large watches, upwards of 50 millimeters. And so, from that perspective, having a large Flieger is more appropriate, I think, than having a large dress watch. I think, that it's like the big dress watches, I think, is kind of what you want to watch out for. There are companies that will make these sort of, giant 45 millimeter dress style watches. And, they're going to have it's going to be like all dial. It's going to be, a dress style. And those ones will look really large on almost anybody's wrist, regardless of what your wrist size is. So keep in mind the situation that you're going to wear the watch. If it's going to be a casual watch, you can kind of get away with it get away with it being a little bit larger than if it's a formal situation. Okay, so that'll wrap it up for today. Let me know down in the comments. Let me know what your wrist size is and what size watch you think looks good on your wrist. And that way, if anybody else is scrolling through, it'll kind of compile a helpful list that they can kind of see different people at different wrist sizes, what they feel like they can get away with. Again, this is very much a personal preference kind of thing. And so I think, it really depends on the person. Some people like larger watches. A lot of people like the look of smaller watches now. But you kind of got to figure out what your own style is. And that's, I think, that's one of the most important things is really, are you comfortable wearing it? Because if you look down on the watch and if you're always wondering, you think, does this look weird? Does it look too big? You're not going to want to wear the watch as much. It's going to take away some of the enjoyment, and it's, probably something that, you're not going to wind up keeping long term. But if you look at the watch and you think, this watch looks great on my wrist, it fits good, you're going to get a lot more wear out of that. So it's a hard call to make because a lot of times there's these watches out there that we just, we love the design and the look, but they just don't fit on our wrist. And you kind of got to let it go. And I've bought watches like that in the past where, they looked great in the pictures. They looked good when other people were wearing them. But when I put it on my wrist, it just didn't feel like it fit quite right. And, those tended to be the watches that I didn't keep around. So you kind of, it's a tough call to make, but I think you got to, at some point kind of make that call and say, well, I can't go with that one, or here's this other one that maybe it didn't attract me as much initially, but when you get it on the wrist and you see the size and the fit and everything, you start to appreciate it more, and and it looks better. So, go ahead and try out different things, see what you like, and try and get a feel for it. But hopefully this kind of helps as you think through it. Again, make sure you watch the previous video because I think, again, that's I think a very useful one for actually trying to figure out what different watches are going to look like on your wrist. So definitely recommend that. Again, let me know what you guys think, and we'll talk to you later.